September 19, 2005, Basra, Iraq. Two men sit on the floor of a police station. Their hands are bound behind their backs. One has a thick bandage covering most of the top of his head. The other has blood on his clothes. Arab satellite cameras have been invited in to film them, and the footage is already transmitting across the region. The room is a serious crimes unit facility in the Jamiat district. Outside, British warrior infantry fighting vehicles have formed a cordon around the compound. The afternoon heat is still brutal. Basra in late September can hit 40 degrees Celsius, and inside a concrete building with no air conditioning and a crowd pressing at the walls, it's worse. The men on the floor aren't in the uniforms they wore this morning. The Arab garments and headdresses that were their cover are gone. They are in the civilian clothes they had underneath, blue jeans, t-shirts. Dressed like men who are trying not to look like soldiers, they are clearly Westerners. They are British Special Forces soldiers from A Squadron, 22nd Special Air Service Regiment. They spent the morning in a surveillance vehicle in a city that has been systematically absorbed by the militia networks they were sent to document. Now they are inside the facility they were watching, displayed on television and separated from the British cordon outside by walls, armed guards, and a chain of command that has just told the regiment assembled outside to wait. They took two of the wrong men, and when command said stand down, the regiment sent one message back: touch them and we all walk. The breach that followed, the vehicles through the walls, the locked room, the chaos at nightfall, that is the story most people tell. This is the one underneath it. Basra in September 2005 wasn't the city British forces had entered 29 months earlier. When the coalition took the city in April 2003, southern Iraq was Shia Arab majority territory, historically suppressed under Saddam Hussein's Sunni-dominated government, cautiously accommodating toward the forces that removed him. The British Army's posture in the south had been deliberately softer than coalition operations elsewhere in Iraq. Work with the emerging Shia power structures, maintain surface stability, allow new institutions room to grow. That approach required functional institutions. By 2005, the most important one, the police, had been quietly hollowed out. The Mahdi army, Jaish al-Mahdi, the armed militia controlled by radical Shia cleric Muqtada al-Sadr, had engaged British forces in sustained combat throughout 2004. The fighting was violent and costly for both sides. It had not prevented the militia from achieving something more strategically significant than a military victory: penetration of the state's security apparatus. The Basra police force, nominally the institution of law and order British forces were helping to build, had been infiltrated across multiple levels. The city's police chief, Hassan Sawadi, told the New York Times in the weeks after September 19th that he didn't trust 3/4 of his own officers. That isn't a measured statistical assessment. It's a police chief describing the institution he commanded as functionally beyond his control. The specific institution the SAS surveillance mission was targeting was the Al-Jamit Serious Crimes Unit, an internal affairs operation in the Jamiat district. On paper, it was a state police facility, housing roughly 200 to 300 officers. In practice, its senior command structure answered to militia networks rather than to the Interior Ministry in Baghdad. A British diplomat on the ground described the unit's leadership as exercising disproportionate influence over both the broader police force and the civilian population of the city. British intelligence had assessed Al-Jamit as a site of extrajudicial detention and violence, operating behind the credentials of a legitimate state institution. Everything that assessment concluded was confirmed in December 2006, when the 1st Battalion Staffordshire Regiment raided Al Jameet under full formal authorisation as part of Operation Sinbad. They freed 127 prisoners showing signs of torture, killed 7 gunmen and demolished the building. But that was 15 months after September 19, 2005. In September 2005, the intelligence pointing to what Al Jameet was had accumulated without yet producing formal action, and the violence of the week before the rescue was part of the reason the gap between knowledge and action felt so acute. On September 5th, Fusilier Donald Anthony Meade and Fusilier Stephen Robert Manning of the Royal Regiment of Fusiliers were killed by a roadside bomb while on patrol west of Basra. Their deaths raised the British fatality count in Iraq to 95. 2 days later, on September 7th, 2 separate bomb attacks struck Basra within hours of each other. The first, a roadside device, killed 4 American security contractors from Triple Canopy, working in support of the US State Department's Diplomatic Security Bureau. The State Department confirmed all 4 deaths by name that afternoon. Hours later, a second attack, a remote-controlled car bomb, detonated near restaurants and shops in a Shia neighborhood, killed between 13 and 16 Iraqi civilians and wounded approximately 20 to 24 more. The New York Times ran the combined headline, "Basra bombs kill 16 Iraqis and 4 US contractors." The full toll for September 7th was at minimum 17 dead, possibly 20. That is the week the city had just come through. 12 days after that, in a Basra that had absorbed those losses and felt the Mahdi army's show of force the day before, 200 fighters blocking roads on September 18th, demanding the release of militia commanders held by British forces, 2 intelligence operators sat bound on a floor and waited to see what their government would do. To understand why what followed wasn't mutiny, you need to understand what the SAS was built to be and who built it. July 1941, North Africa. Lieutenant David Stirling, a Scottish Scots Guards officer recovering from a parachuting accident in a Cairo hospital, had a concept for a new kind of unit and no conventional pathway to pitch it. He wasn't senior enough to request an audience with the relevant generals. The normal chain of command would have routed his proposal through layers of officers with no reason to approve it and several institutional reasons not to. He found a different path. Stirling talked his way past a sentry, reportedly still on crutches from his injury, and walked uninvited into Middle East headquarters in Cairo. He presented his proposal directly to Major General Neil Ritchie. Ritchie arranged a meeting with the Commander-in-Chief, General Claude Auchinleck. The concept was radical in its simplicity. Very small teams, initially 5 officers and approximately 60 other ranks, operating deep behind Axis lines without fixed base or supply chain, conducting surprise raids on airfields, headquarters, and logistics infrastructure. Insertion by land, sea, or air. Extended independent operation without external support. Each member trained and capable of leading the mission if the commander fell. Objectives chosen and adjusted in the field based on current intelligence, not pre-authorized by headquarters working on days-old information. The unit would carry enough fuel, rations and ammunition to sustain itself for extended periods, find its targets, hit them in darkness, and disappear before daylight brought air support down on their position. Auchinleck approved it. The unit was designated L Detachment, Special Air Service Brigade, a deliberately misleading name constructed to suggest a much larger airborne capability than existed as part of a broader British deception campaign. The name was a lie built into the founding paperwork. The first mission, Operation Squatter in November 1941, A parachute raid on Axis airfields at Gazala and Tamimi in support of Operation Crusader was scattered by a desert storm and achieved little. The concept survived because the concept was sound. The regiment went on to destroy hundreds of Axis aircraft on the ground across North Africa, operating in exactly the small team autonomous mode Sterling had designed. Move in darkness, hit hard, make the decision about the target in the field, get out before the enemy can respond at scale. By September 1942, L Detachment was redesignated the 1st SAS Regiment. Sterling was promoted to Lieutenant Colonel. He was captured by the Germans in 1943. The motto he chose was, "Who dares wins." His institutional logic ran deeper than tactics. Headquarters always operates on older information than the team in the field. Authorization from above requires time. In operations behind enemy lines, or 64 years later, in the back streets of a hostile city with 2 men running out of hours, time is what kills people. A force designed to act on current intelligence, revising its own objectives in response to actual conditions, is structurally faster than any opponent waiting on permission before reacting. The design argument wasn't subtle. Sterling had demonstrated it before articulating it, by walking past his own chain of command on crutches to create the regiment in the first place. The design travelled. In 1962, US Army Colonel Charles Alvin Beckwith was assigned as an exchange officer with 22 SAS, commanding 3 Troop, A Squadron, conducting counterinsurgency operations in the Malaya, Indonesia theatre. He served alongside men trained in Sterling's founding concept. He contracted severe leptospirosis during jungle operations. He came home with a body that took months to recover, and with detailed proposals for an American equivalent of what he had seen and served alongside. On November 19, 1977, 36 years after Sterling limped past the sentry in Cairo, Beckwith formally established the 1st Special Forces Operational Detachment Delta Force. Explicitly modelled on 22 SAS in structure, selection and operational philosophy. The US Army Special Warfare Center's own biographical record confirms that Beckwith conceived, forged and developed his concept for an SAS-type unit following his exchange tour with the British Regiment. Delta Force was built in the image of the SAS, not the reverse. That order of precedence matters when the question is whether the SAS in 2005 was acting against its founding identity or acting exactly in accordance with it. Operation Hathor was the covert surveillance mission the 2 operators were running when they were taken. The specific target was a senior figure in the Al-Jamit Serious Crimes Unit, an officer assessed as corrupt, assessed as connected to the Mahdi army, and assessed as directly involved in the extrajudicial violence the facility was facilitating behind its state police credentials. The job was intelligence collection. Establish the network, document the connections, build the case that could justify formal action against the facility and its commanders. The work required invisibility. The 2 operators wore traditional Arab garments and headdresses. Their vehicle was a local civilian car, not military, not marked, chosen to pass without notice in Basra traffic alongside ordinary commercial vehicles, taxis, and the daily movement of a city with no shortage of men conducting business on the street. One of the soldiers involved in the mission, Sergeant Colin McLachlan, gave a public account of his service in 2021 that confirms the broad operational parameters. He described the cover as including fake tan and hair dye, the physical transformation required to sustain a covert identity in an environment where a single unconvincing detail could mean capture. This was the level of preparation these men were operating at. Not soldiers in light disguise, operators whose survival on the ground depended on their ability to disappear into the texture of a city that wanted them dead. September 19. Their vehicle was stopped at an Iraqi police checkpoint. What happened at the checkpoint is documented in multiple contemporaneous sources. An officer approached the car and attempted to drag one of the men out of the vehicle. The operators opened fire. At least 2 Iraqi police officers were shot. At least 1 died. The operators drove off with police vehicles in pursuit. Unable to outrun them through Basra's streets, they made a decision: stop and try to talk their way through it. That decision, in a city where the police force was heavily compromised by militia networks and where a police officer had just been killed by the men they were now trying to negotiate with, wasn't a decision that could end well. They were beaten at the scene, handcuffed, put in a vehicle and driven to Al-Jamit, the same facility whose command structure they had spent the morning watching from a distance. The journey from surveillance target to prisoner inside that target took perhaps 30 minutes. At Al-Jamit, they were beaten again and then photographed. Arab satellite broadcasters were given access to film them. This wasn't an accident. The commander of the Al-Jamit unit, identified in Jack Fairweather's account of the British campaign in Iraq as Jafar, a man who had run the serious crimes unit since 2004, with what a British diplomat described as disproportionate influence over the city's security apparatus, understood the propaganda value of what he had. 2 Western intelligence operatives, visibly injured, sitting bound on the floor of his police station, broadcast across the region before the British military had confirmed their identities. It was a public humiliation designed to force a choice: accept the loss of 2 soldiers by diplomatic means, or escalate publicly and visibly in a city already on edge. The names Campbell and Griffin appear consistently in secondary retellings of the incident, but were never confirmed in contemporaneous mainstream journalism. The BBC, the New York Times, and Al Jazeera all reported the incident without naming the men. Sergeant Colin McLachlan is the only figure to have given a public first-person account. Both names, Campbell and Griffin, are used here as they appear in later accounts, with the understanding that they may function as operational identifiers rather than confirmed surnames. 20 members of A Squadron flew from Baghdad to Basra within hours of the initial report. A platoon of paratroopers from the Special Forces Support Group joined them. The 1st Battalion Coldstream Guards, with warrior infantry fighting vehicles, established a cordon outside Al-Jamit. A Lynx helicopter provided continuous aerial coverage to the UK Joint Operations Centre. The SAS Quick Reaction Force was in the city. The surveillance picture was live. The location of the target was known. The assault force was assembled and standing by. The stand-down came from permanent joint headquarters at Northwood. The legal and political logic behind that order is documented and, in isolation, not unreasonable. Under the sovereignty framework transferred to the Iraqi interim government in the summer of 2004, British forces operated within procedures requiring negotiation before force when detainees were held by Iraqi authorities. An Iraqi government existed, on paper, with jurisdiction over what happened inside Iraqi police facilities. The Iraqi Interior Minister had already ordered the release of the 2 men to multinational forces. The order was legitimate. The problem was that the institution receiving the order didn't answer to the Interior Ministry. It answered to the men who had just moved the hostages. British military legal officer Rabia Sadiq was dispatched to the station as part of the negotiation effort, carrying official demands for the soldiers' release. 2 officers from 12th Brigade HQ arrived at the compound with an ultimatum letter. Both sets of negotiators were allowed inside. Then the doors closed. The officers from 12th Brigade were themselves detained. The people sent to negotiate the release of the captured soldiers were now prisoners alongside them. Outside the compound walls, the afternoon deteriorated steadily. The Mahdi army presence in the streets around Al-Jamit wasn't spontaneous. The previous day's show of force, 200 fighters blocking Basra roads, demanding the release of militia commanders, had already established that the militia understood what British armour surrounding one of their facilities meant. Now that armour was there and the streets were filling. Stones hit the vehicles first, then petrol bombs. One warrior infantry fighting vehicle was set alight. British Private Carl Hynett, 19 years old, was filmed scrambling from his burning vehicle through a door on the far side, away from the crowd, clothing smoking, moving fast across the ground. That image moved globally within hours. 3 British soldiers received injuries during the afternoon, none life-threatening. At least 2 Iraqi demonstrators were killed in the clashes around the station. The stand-down was holding while the temperature around the compound rose and the afternoon burned down toward evening. Inside the compound, Jafar, the Al-Jamit commander, was watching the arithmetic. British armour outside meant British assault forces somewhere nearby. Negotiations inside meant delays, not guarantees. The 2 men on his floor were, from his perspective, either leverage or a liability, and as the afternoon went on, they were becoming more of the second and less of the first. Leverage only works if the party on the other side believes you'll use it, or that they can't simply take what they want. When the British cordon didn't leave by afternoon, the calculation changed. He had the men loaded into the boot of a car. The car left the compound, turned into Basra's back streets, and drove to a house not far from Al-Jamit. The cordon outside was surrounding a building that no longer held the people it was there to recover. The links overhead caught it. The camera tracked the car out of the compound, through the streets, to its destination. The footage was fed directly to the Joint Operations Centre. The location of the house was identified. The assault plan was revised on the spot. One secondary account, sourced through military journalism and not confirmed in any official record, attributes to a senior PJHQ general the statement that permission wasn't granted and that there were more important things than the lives of soldiers. Whether those specific words were spoken can't be verified. What the full weight of testimonial and journalistic evidence consistently reflects is the posture. Assets in place, location known, authorization withheld, men running out of time. Colonel John Lorimer of 12th Mechanized Brigade held the command in Basra. Mark Urban's Task Force Black records that by mid-afternoon, British commanders gave the authority to assault the police station. Business Insider's account of the operation, drawing on participant testimony, describes the SAS having moved with post-facto political and military sanction, catching up to a decision already made on the ground. The 2 accounts aren't necessarily contradictory. Authorization that arrives while the wheels are already turning isn't the same as authorization granted in advance. It's a mistake to push a man to violence when violence is the thing he has spent his life perfecting. After nightfall on September 19th, around 9 in the evening, the operation moved. The Warrior IFVs and Challenger 2 tanks that had been sitting in the cordon rolled forward. They drove into the compound walls of Al-Jamit and broke through them. An Associated Press reporter who had been in the city all day watched armoured vehicles smash into the jail. The noise in that neighbourhood would have been tremendous. 62-ton tanks and 28-ton infantry fighting vehicles hitting concrete walls aren't quiet instruments. The compound lit up. Inside, guards scattered. Prisoners who had been locked in the facility throughout the day of chaos found their way through the breach in the darkness and ran. An Iraqi television cameraman who lived directly across the street from the jail watched from his building and counted. He reported approximately 150 prisoners escaping Al-Jamit in the chaos of the breach. That figure was independently reported the same night by CBS News and by the Associated Press. The Ministry of Defense initially denied the raid entirely and then denied the prisoner escape specifically. The 150 prisoners weren't the mission. They were the consequence of the force required. Armoured vehicles breaking through compound walls at night, guards abandoning their posts, locks becoming irrelevant. Some of those prisoners were political detainees, people being held without process by a facility that had been documented as operating outside any legal framework. Some were general criminal detainees. The escape wasn't a liberation story. It was a security liability created by the scale of force necessary to recover two people who shouldn't have been there in the first place. Simultaneously, the SAS assault team moved on the house. The house assault met no resistance. They went through the door and found the two men in a locked room. The specific detail that circulates most widely, that Campbell and Griffin were found handcuffed in a bathroom, appears in later feature journalism and narrative accounts. The contemporaneous sourcing confirms a locked room inside the house, confirms the men were beaten, confirms they were alive. Whatever the precise configuration of the room, the operational reality is this. Two men who had been taken in the morning transferred once during the afternoon to a secondary location and were by most secondary account assessments hours from execution, were found alive at night by the people who came for them. Beaten, but alive. Basra Governor Mohammed Al-Waili issued his public statement within hours. Barbaric, savage and irresponsible. He said the British had used more than 10 tanks backed by helicopters to attack and destroy the central jail. He announced that the Basra Provincial Council was terminating its formal relations with British forces. The diplomatic cost was immediate and real. British officials in Iraq responded the following morning by ruling out any apology, pointing out that the Basra police had directly disobeyed an order from their own interior ministry. The Ministry of Defence's initial denial that they had stormed the prison held less than a day. Defence Secretary John Reid stepped before cameras on September 20th and said the commander's decision was absolutely right, noting that the men would likely have been killed had British forces waited for negotiations to resolve themselves. The institutional cover story lasted approximately 18 hours. The institutional endorsement of what actually happened took slightly longer. In the days that followed, the possibility of disciplinary consequences for the men who had conducted the rescue was reportedly raised. The exact mechanism isn't in the public record. No mainstream contemporaneous journalism describes formal disciplinary charges filed against SAS personnel specifically for the Basra rescue. No court-martial proceedings for the operation are documented in any official source. In the aftermath of September 19, the SAS task force in Iraq, designated Task Force Black, was said in later accounts to have been renamed Task Force Night, a change that reflected the political sensitivity of the Basra operation and the institutional scrutiny that was now attached to it. Mark Urban's Task Force Black, published in 2012 and described in reviews as a work the Ministry of Defence would prefer had not been written, covers the Basra episode with operational detail that reviewers characterised as documenting unforgivable indecisiveness in the British military and political chain of command. The book exists because the story of what happened and what almost happened required telling. John Reid's public endorsement of the commander's decision is the strongest available signal of how any disciplinary question resolved. A Secretary of State for Defense publicly calling the commander's judgment absolutely right isn't consistent with simultaneous formal proceedings against the same commander for the same action. The endorsement was politically convenient. It closed the question before it could be answered in any other way. Whether that was the intent or merely the effect, it's what happened. What circulates within regimental testimony, widely repeated, consistently framed, originating from people who describe direct knowledge, is a specific account of what happened in the narrow window before Reed's statement closed the question. When the possibility of consequences for the rescuers was raised, the regiment answered as one body. If any man who went through the wall that night faced punishment for it, the regiment would resign together. Not a petition. Not a formal document routed through the chain of command. A collective declaration of institutional identity, communicated in the way the regiment communicates when the stakes are absolute. These men did what we were built to do, and we won't exist in a form that punishes them for it. There is no filed resignation letter. There is no official record of this threat in any archive this research surfaces. The claim appears in community accounts, in soldiers' testimony forums, in the consistent framing of people who describe themselves as having direct knowledge of what was said and by whom. It's included here not because it can be verified against a primary source, but because it's coherent with everything that preceded it. A force whose founding act was its creator walking uninvited past his own chain of command. A force whose design principle is that the team closest to the problem has the authority to solve it. A force that had just watched two of its operators sit bound on a foreign floor while the bureaucracy above it managed the optics. That force does not require a document to explain why it would refuse to let the men who acted on its founding logic take the consequences alone. The resignation threat, widely attested in regimental account, is best understood as an expression of institutional identity rather than evidence of institutional rebellion. The SAS wasn't threatening to become something other than what it was. It was communicating what it had always been. No one was punished. The regiment wasn't touched. David Stirling walked into Middle East headquarters in July 1941 because the conventional approach would have produced the wrong answer too slowly. He built a force designed to operate on the same logic. The team closest to the problem has better information than the headquarters authorizing from a distance. And authorization from a distance is precisely what gets people killed in the time it takes to arrive. He demonstrated the principle before writing it into doctrine, by demonstrating it while pitching the doctrine itself. 64 years later, in a city that had just absorbed 20 or more casualties across a single week, in a police compound whose commander had already transferred his prisoners once and was working toward a second and final move, a regiment built in 1941 to finish jobs that other structures couldn't reach, made the same calculations Stirling made in a Cairo corridor. The right answer exists. The conventional path to authorization is too slow to deliver it, and the men at the front have the information and the capacity to act. What followed wasn't chaos. It was precision. Warrior IFVs through compound walls, a Lynx camera tracking a car through city streets, a simultaneous assault on 2 locations, a team going through a door in the dark to find men who were still alive. The scale of the force required was significant. The political cost was immediate. The alternative was waiting until morning to conduct a negotiation with an institution that had already stopped negotiating and started planning an execution. The same act that made these men untouchable to parts of their own government made them legends to their country. They were told to leave their brothers behind. They didn't. When the system reached for punishment, the regiment answered as one body, not with rebellion, but with the founding reflex of a force created in 1941 to do what is needed, whether or not it was told to. That is what "Who Dares Wins" actually costs. And that is why the men who did it are remembered as heroes by their country and as a problem by the paperwork. Subscribe for more stories like this.